It's episode 439 of This is Whole Life, and this is the podcast from the Whole Life Church in Orlando, Florida, where every week we go and dig a little bit deeper into the things that are happening here at the Whole Life Church. And hold on a second, we have a technical problem here in the studio, which has been fixed, and now Ken can hear, and it's loud. Week 2 of the Dominion series, which covers the book of, not really the book, the first 6 chapters?
Really the first 6. We'll dive a little bit into some of the other, some of the prophecy at the end of the book of Daniel, 7 through 12, but really it's the first 6
So hang on
chapters.
for the prophecy.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're not there yet. This was chapter 2, and this was the dream. And I don't know if, like, growing up, when you do the story of Daniel, of course, if you grew up Adventist, and we've talked about my Bible story friends, it's always the focus is the food, and they get moved from the invasion of Babylon, of Jerusalem, they go to Babylon, and they're found wiser, and it's a good story to make sure you young folks eat all the green things on your plate. Never worked for me that much, but anyway, it was a good story. The dream. It's like one of those things that if you feel like the Bible's like way before its time when it comes to creative script writing, because you couldn't really write a story any better than the things that he's asking his scribes. What was it? Scribes, sorcerers. Sorcerers make it sound like...
I think the easiest way to think of it is more in terms of a guild. There are different people who had different functions, right. But basically it was the guild that was in charge of giving advice to the king, and part of that advice could be interpreting
from
dreams.
Everybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it wasn't just that. I guess maybe I missed that part. You did say the guild, and I thought that gave it a... and I don't play, but it sounds like very Dungeons and Dragons. So I've never played it, but it...
Well,
the
guild is
guild.
usually... Yeah, it's not...
It sounds very medieval.
It's really not... Okay, well, maybe we ought to define guild for everybody, since...
Because Melanie's not here this morning to define the guild.
But, as I look up the definition, it says a medieval association of craftsmen or merchants. But really the better one is actually the definition, an association of people for mutual aid or in the pursuit of a common goal. And so this particular group of people, their responsibility was to provide advice and counsel to the king. And part of that was, in those times, in that place, was interpretation of dreams, because they believed that the gods would give the king dreams that would help the king know what was going to happen.
I thought it was interesting, and I had never heard this before, that like they kept records of previous dreams, so that they had something to work off of as a baseline.
Whoa. Yeah, I didn't know that either before preparing for this sermon. I found that piece of information in the IVP Bible Background Commentary on the Old Testament. But yeah, they basically kept records of people's dreams, and then what would happen afterwards, and then also, if you see a snake, it means this. If you see water, it means that. Much like we do today. Like if you're a Seventh-day Adventist and you've done any study into the book of Revelation, Daniel, there's some imagery that hopefully you're aware of, that water represents large groups of people. That there's just a number of different. When you see this, a horn represents power. There's a lot of different images that in a vision or in prophecy that when you see this, it can mean this. And so they did the same thing. They kept records of, this king had this vision, and then that happened, and so and another king had a vision, and a similar thing happened after, and so they would kind of come up with that, and then so they would go to the books, they'd research, and they'd come back and say, hey, this is. I think we kind of have this idea that these people kind of just made things up off the top of their head, and so, which maybe there was some of that as well, but there was also a bit of a science to it at that time.
I always felt like it was like more sorcery, like dark magic.
Yeah.
What they were like, putting the tea leaves into the cauldron and giving it a stir and see what comes up. But this at least has some grounding to it. I thought that was just really unique for that story.
Yeah, when you think that when you go back, that Daniel actually was educated in the ways of this particular group of people. Yeah. And the Bible uses a number of different words for it. There's the enchanters, the sorcerers, the blah, 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 blah. And again, I think when we hear those words, you kind of go back to Dungeons and Dragons or medieval stuff and have that. And I think there may have been a bit of an element of that, but I think it's also important to recognize that Daniel was educated in this. That's one of the things that the 3 years he was being educated in these things. And so it's hard for me to imagine that Daniel was down with learning how to summon demons and kind of dark magic kind of things, that he would have been like, oh yeah, let me go ahead and learn that. But it does seem plausible that maybe he was learning, well, this dream means that, and that there was a lot of different elements that it would have been more comfortable for him to go, okay, well, that's interesting. Not that, and again, I think to the point of today's story is that at the end of all of it, you trust God. He trusts God to actually be the one to interpret, not all the knowledge that he gained necessarily.
Yeah. Did you?
No.
Oh, you were looking something up on your phone. I was like,
I'm looking at the sermon here.
I'm like, if you can read that the way it is, there's like on his phone, there's like 4 pages. I'm like, if he comes up with a comment out of this without zooming in, then I'm like, you really.
He's young. He's young.
He's young. Maybe he pulls it
his
up.
eyes are better than ours. His brain is more sharp.
Not as young as Daniel, though.
Yeah.
No. You're not. Yeah, you're older than Daniel probably was at that point. Yeah.
Dare to be a Daniel, right?
Mm-hmm.
Isn't
right.
that? Where did that just come from?
That's a good song from.
That just popped in from
childhood.
Somewhere.
Extra credit if you sing it for us.
Oh, I'll let
Dare to be a Daniel. Okay,
stand alone.
Yeah, there you go.
No, that's bad.
Yeah.
That's bad. No carrying tunes this early in the morning. Not any time, but particularly not now.
We'll take you up on that tonight. We'll
maybe we'll do a live tonight, and I'll sing "Dare to Be a Daniel" live. Sure, that's gonna happen.
See if Albert lets you on the praise team.
He already said I don't get to play. So. The other part that I maybe didn't have put together as well or a realization that came from the message too, that Daniel didn't slam dunk on the other guys.
No, yeah.
And, that should have been maybe more obvious to me, but before this, but really to come back and just it's like, how do you know if God is using you? And it's like, I think there's your clue right there, that he gives all the credit to God, and then he also says, and these other guys who, eventually these are probably the same people that eventually get him thrown into the lion's den, depending on, I don't know how long that distance is between those.
It's a good bit of distance.
It's a good bit, I know.
It's completely different empire.
But a different empire.
So the chances of them being the same people, probably more slim. And plus at that point.
Because he was older at that point.
Daniel would have been his 80s at that point.
And this was when he was still a teenager.
And if these were more seasoned advisors, they
were probably dead already.
So yeah, and you know how it is. Let 5 or 10 years go by, and people forget completely about whatever favors were done 5 or 10 years ago.
Yeah, that's true. But even if it's not the case, just the fact that he went to bat for them and was like, "Look,
absolutely,
there's nobody can do this." And then I also thought how great that makes God look, because then it's like, we can't do it, and I did because of God, but here's the only one that can do it, and It's just like, that was just a make you smile moment. The way that when you just stop and think about that for a little bit. So this dream, like, we have to do this, and maybe I missed it in the message. Were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were they charged with this as well? They weren't on this. Were they on the same level as Daniel in this?
They would have been. Okay. They would have been murdered as well, or they were executed. Yeah, their heads were on the line.
Okay, so henceforth the most tense midweek prayer meeting in history.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so they had skin in the game in this too.
For sure,
they were in this same guild, as it were. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that answers that. And then he mentions that God wants Nebuchadnezzar to know the future. Why? Why is it important for God to say, look, Neb, you need to know what's going on and what's coming up?
I think there's, I mean, this can be a pretty long discussion, but I would just venture a couple of my thoughts on this that, number one, God was trying to establish with Nebuchadnezzar where the true source of power comes from. And so rather than Nebuchadnezzar thinking that he was the person who held his own fate in his hands and he could control the future, and if he just was a smart enough king that he could make things happen for himself, God was basically trying to point out to Nebuchadnezzar, no, I'm in charge of this. Any good things that happen are because I allow it. And so God's kind of the book of Daniel is trying to point out, not just to in the story it's to Nebuchadnezzar, but to the readers, it's trying to point out that really God is in control of things, and that we can as another part of the Bible says, we can have our own plans, but God is the one that controls what really ultimately happens. So there's that aspect of things. I think the other part of it is that that God is he's trying to develop a relationship with Nebuchadnezzar. I think he wants Nebuchadnezzar to have a relationship with him, and he's basically saying, "Hey, buddy, hey, I'm right here. You're kind of worshiping the wrong gods. You're kind of headed in the wrong direction here, and here I am. Can I get your attention? Can I help you out a little bit here?" So I think those are two different things. There's probably more there. And that's one of the things I think is really fun. One of the nicest things people will say to me is, your sermon really made me go think, and I came up with a bunch of stuff that you didn't say. And I'm like, that's awesome. That's fantastic. If I prompt you to go home and think, and you come up with different ideas than the ones I had, that's fantastic. I think that's great. I mean, take it to another. That's one of the goals that I have in preaching, is not to have the answers all the time, but to prompt you to think more deeply about what the Bible's trying to say and what God's trying to say to you. Because the fact of the matter is, we can read the same story in the Bible, and God can be trying to say something to me that's completely different than what he's trying to say to you.
So do you think the idea of, there's so much going on with you've got the statue, the head of gold, chest of silver, stomach and thighs of bronze, legs of iron, feet mixed iron and clay. And then what's the significance of a rock cut out of a mountain that is not done by a human hand? Like, what does that mean?
So
I don't understand.
Yeah, let me. I promised a couple people, they're like, hey, why don't we get into what each one of those things represents? And so let me take a minute just to do that here. And I promised them in the podcast I'd take a minute to talk about this because it's important. One of the easier ways to kind of figure out what's going on here in this, how things line up, is to look at the rest of Daniel. So Daniel 7, 8, and 9 specifically are good places to go if you're wanting to also understand the statue, because Daniel 7 in particular parallels this statue. There's going to be beasts in Daniel 7 that correlate with the different parts of this statue. So but let's talk about the statue. So there's the head of gold. Daniel is very clear in Daniel 2. He says, Nebuchadnezzar, that's you. You're the head of gold. Babylon, this is the head of gold. And he said, but there will be other kingdoms that come after you, but they're going to be inferior to you, just as these other metals are inferior to gold. Yeah. So always good to give a narcissist something to work with.
Start off on the good side. That's good.
So then we go to the chest of silver, and historically speaking, the Adventist Church has said this, but it's not just the Adventist Church. If you look back to the Protestant Reformation, many Protestants have the same exact interpretation of what's going on here. Mm-hmm. And so you have your chest of silver, which is the Medes and Persians. And one of the fun things about this, if you want to, when you start kind of taking this vision that God gave Nebuchadnezzar apart and taking a look at it, when most people have a dominant hand, right? Like I'm left-handed. I think both of you are right-handed, right?
Yeah.
So you have a dominant hand. Well, in the coalition between the Medes and the Persians, there's a dominant group, and it starts off with the Medes being dominant, but then it actually moves over to the Persians, and the Persians wind up being the dominant force. So some scholars, when they look at that particular thing, they're like, oh, look, that's pretty amazing that God actually lines up some specific features here to correlate with the country and the empires that are ruling. So after the Babylonians comes the Medes and the Persians. And then after that, you have your belly and thighs that are made of bronze, and this would be the Greece.
Yep.
And I heard one theologian make the comment that basically Greece has impacted almost every world power that has come after with a lot of their ideas, particularly, I should ever say Western world powers. So you think about the way the United States does things. When we use the word politics, that's from Greek.
Yeah.
It's a Greek thing. It's and the population, and so there's this. So the Greeks really heavily influenced many of the empires that came after them. The Romans for sure, right? So this one theologian says, interesting, the particular part of the body that's being used there, that there be some reproductive parts in that part of the body, and so this part of this nation that comes over kind of creates a lot of ideas and things that come after them. And so there's that. And then you have the legs of iron, which is the Roman Empire that comes afterwards. And literally, iron is a big thing. They basically go over, just crush the rest of the world with these legs of iron. And then after that, you have the feet of iron and clay, which, again, this one's a lot more controversial about what that is. Seventh-day Adventist, it's not controversial within Seventh-day Adventist circles, but outside of Seventh-day Adventist circles, it is a very controversial, what is this? But Seventh-day Adventists look at this and they see the mixed feet as basically Europe, and after the Romans kind of meld into what will become these European superpowers that never really kind of completely meld together. They try to have intermarriage to try to bring themselves together, but even to this day, the European Union doesn't particularly function super well. And you saw Brexit and all this, and so basically the prophecy is that this iron and clay will never really thoroughly come together and actually work together. And so where does America play into that? Well, you have to move further into Daniel and into the book of Revelation, which these two books go together very much. And again, Seventh-day Adventists have a pretty well-developed idea of what these things mean. And so within Seventh-day Adventist theology, we have a very developed idea of what we believe these prophecies mean. And so anyway, so when you look at this, getting down to your final, what you originally asked, so you have all these nations. But what I think one of the things I thought about when you think about this statue, all these things are existing at the same time in the statue, right? They're all there. It's one thing that's there. Unlike Daniel 7 where you have separate beasts, this is one statue. It's basically every earthly kingdom is there at the same time. And we tend to think, okay, there's the head of gold, and then after that comes the chest of silver. But if you're a body, you're one thing. And so there's this one thing. And so when you think about what's happening in Daniel's vision, what becomes significant is exactly the question you asked me. What's going to happen to these earthly kingdoms that are all one thing here, these man-made kingdoms? What's going to happen? Well, a rock without hands is going to be carved out of the side of a mountain. And so what's being implied here is something supernatural is happening, something that's inexplicable, that's beyond the human realm. This rock is going to be carved out of the mountain. It's going to smash into the feet, but it's not just going to topple the statue so it just falls over. And because that's one of the things you can imagine happening. If something hits the feet, it takes the thing off balance and it falls and it just lays there on the ground. But no, this rock actually smashes the feet, but it also causes the entire statue to completely disintegrate into dust that gets blown away with the wind.
Yeah.
And then this rock grows into a mountain that's everlasting. And I know Melanie had hoped to be here today, and unfortunately she had something that came up. But there's some symbols in Jewish theology about mountains. One thing is that that was kind of thought about of the Jewish people, and I wanted to give you but basically you'll see in the Old Testament that like the Philistines didn't want to fight with the Jewish people up in the hills. They wanted to pull them down to the plains. And the reason is that there was this belief that Israel's God was the God of mountains. Think about Mount Sinai, the God of the hills. And that's so when you hear the Bible text that says, I'll turn my eyes to the hills, where does my salvation come from? No, it comes from God. Is this idea that the Israelites' power came from geography, that basically gods were kind of most powerful in certain places and less powerful in other places. And so this mountain that appears is basically the symbol of the God of Israel, who comes and actually crushes every earthly kingdom that ever will be and replaces them with a godly kingdom. And when you look at Daniel 7 and you look at these earthly kingdoms, they're all symbolized by these vicious beasts. When you look at Daniel 7, these beasts are allowed to do horrendous things. They tear flesh apart, and and the point that God is making through these prophecies is that human governments, human-built nations are almost always destructive. They almost always become destructive. They almost always hurt people and are vicious. And the only kingdom that isn't going to be that is that final kingdom that is God's kingdom, Christ, the solid rock.
Yeah.
That Christ's kingdom is a kingdom of love and peace and even though, and that's the problem, by the way, and somebody say, well, I don't think Christians are particularly loving. Well, that's because we're humans.
Yeah.
So what will often happen is we'll take that good kingdom that Christ wants us to have, and we'll try to, again, take it back to the statue. We want to turn it into a human kingdom again. And human kingdoms are violent. They take away rights from people. They harm people. They take away freedom often. And we've been blessed to live in the United States that there has been freedom here, but there's also not been freedom. We think about slavery.
Yeah.
There are a lot of people that didn't experience freedom because of that. And so there's this, it's one of those things where we often want to look at our country and make ourselves the good guys. And instead of recognizing that human kingdoms can do really good things and they can do really bad things.
Yeah.
In the United States, I think it's really destructive not to admit that the United States has done some very destructive things, some things
absolutely.
that have. And that doesn't mean that you can't love your country. In fact, maybe loving your country is trying to help it be better and do better moving forward. But it's destructive to say, oh, no, there's always been freedom, or there was freedom, or you know what? Human kingdoms just generally are not going to ever be what God's kingdom, what God has in store. And I think that one of our responsibilities as Christians here on earth is to be living the kingdom now, that kingdom of peace, that kingdom of freedom for others. In other words, I know what I want for me as freedom goes, but am I thinking about what you want and what freedom looks like for you? I find it just fascinating that God could have forced Adam and Eve to do things.
Sure.
He could have done that, but God allows freedom. He allows human beings to do things that wouldn't be what He'd want them to do, but it's part of them having freedom.
Having that freedom.
And I think the same thing we need to think about that very much when it comes to others. I often hear people wanting to take away freedom from groups that aren't like them. Say, well, they shouldn't do that. That's not right. And the question is, well, it's easy to take away the freedom from a group that's not like you.
Sure. Yeah.
But how would you feel if the things that mattered to you were being taken away? And so I think that we really have to think about that heavily. And stand up for people who maybe don't have the same beliefs and maybe do things very differently than we think they ought to be done, but they aren't causing they're not destructive. I think we can all agree it's not good to murder other people, but I know. And Randy's looking very disappointed. But this is where it gets tricky, because as human beings we start saying, well, but, so I think the good news in the end is that rock will grow into the mountain, and someday God's kingdom will be established.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the part that I wanted we had a few questions. We had this week. We kind of had the trifecta. We had the text message, we had the email, and we had the questions in the chat. So we kind of got it from all different.
Did we get a voicemail?
We didn't get a. Oh man, that would have been.
I was thinking, man, this would be really the week.
And I still feel bad for Carolina Dave, who did actually do the voicemail, which was found after the fact and never got played. But sorry,
try again.
Yeah. Please try again. Well, the other part that I kind of second services, I was of course in the chat with everybody at the online family, but also just sitting there, and when you started talking about that, God wants to use us. God used Daniel. Daniel was involved in politics, and we can be involved in politics. And it got really quiet in the worship center. And well, I don't disagree at all. Be educated, learn what you can, be as smart as you can about our political processes and all that. And when I hear the idea of being involved is I vote, I'm involved, I speak, and I vote for things that I think Jesus believed in or what the scriptures teach. And I'm like, wow. On one hand, don't disagree, but on the other hand, that's a really narrow line and a deep chasm to cross if you're really just doing an internal gut check. Is that what I'm consistently doing? Am I really voting for what Jesus would vote for? Am I really what the scriptures teach? And I'm like, we have over 200, I think, what did we say? It was over 200 denominations in the United States. And so we have what Jesus believed and what the Bible teaches has a lot of connotations to it because of just that alone. And, and Jesus believed in all the things, helping the poor, the least of these, the immigrants, all those things. And then he reminded us to live by the law and the land and the government that he put there. And I'm like, oh, it's so hard for me it almost feels like the political process for a Christian sometimes is a little dirty. You do it in the dark, under the cover of darkness, and don't say what you would really mean, and don't talk about this, because I feel like in some way I'm speaking for God in a way that I may not even understand. And that's the scary part, when someone comes up and says, oh, I can't believe you believe this because of this. And you go, okay, well, I can see where you're coming from, but that would have never crossed my mind necessarily, because that's not, like you said, that's not where I'm at. That's not the person that I am, or the place that I people hang out with. And I'm just like, how do we feel good? How do we feel good about, get your vote out there, let your voice be heard, all those things. And then at the end of the day, just feel like I don't need to take a shower or two. Because sometimes that's how it feels with where we are and with what's going on.
Well, I wonder how Daniel must have felt something similar to that. He's working in an empire that's not particularly kind, loving, or gracious in the way that they go about doing things. And yet Daniel does what he can within the sphere that God's put him. And I think that's the part for me. It's one of the reasons why I believe that all human governments are going to be flawed. They just are. Parties, I do think some parties are better than other parties. I do think that some candidates are vastly superior to other candidates. That said, almost all of them have their downsides, their flaws, the parts that you're like, well, I agree with 90%, but this 10% is pretty troubling.
Yeah.
And so I think that's one of the things we have to understand, is that we do the best that we can. When it comes to what we think about, we really do I think we have to think about, that great commandment, and think about, are we enabling other people to love God the way that they want to love God? and not just the way I want to love God, but am I giving somebody who's on the exact opposite side of the spectrum the same freedom that I want to have? So for the atheist out there, am I giving them the freedom to be able to live their belief systems and the things that they strongly believe? I think we tend to want to take away the freedoms of people who don't believe what we do, and we want to enhance the freedoms of our own thought process. And the problem with that is that I don't believe that's godly. I think that our Christian arguments need to stand on their own feet, and they don't need a government to enforce them, because governments are always going to do it poorly. I think as Christians, let our lives do the talking. If we believe that something's not right morally from our biblical understanding, well, let our lives do that. It's kind of like you hear different groups that will talk about, it's so important that we do this, and then they do the exact opposite. And when you find out they're doing the exact opposite behind closed doors,
Sure.
And so it's basically that becomes very discouraging, and it looks bad on God when those things happen. So, again, I think that when we think about what we support and what we do and how we vote, it comes down to the Great Commandment. Are we voting to enable ourselves and others to follow God as the way they choose? Are we voting for policies and people that promote loving our neighbor as ourself? Are we thinking about that? And I know there's tension, because we think, okay, well, but there's tension in there about, well, maybe loving this neighbor means that I'm not loving a different neighbor, or I'm not, and so it becomes difficult at times, and good people will come to different conclusions on that. But again, that goes back to what I was talking about a bit in the sermon, which is that it's time to spend time with God, asking, what is it? How should I be? What should I be supporting? What should I not be supporting? But, having been a political reporter covering politics and covering a lot of politicians, I will just tell you, for me, people, I think you need to be wary about the news. Almost every news outlet is going to slant the news in a certain way. And I don't say that to be negative to news. I appreciate the news, read the news, listen to the news, with a giant grain of salt. But I'm going to report I was very keenly aware of this. As a reporter, I really tried to be as neutral as I possibly could, but it's very hard not to bring your worldview and your biases into it. I was raised in North Carolina. I am a white male. I have a certain level of education. These are all things that slant the way I view the world.
Sure.
And so when I report, as much as I try to keep that out of it, I don't know anybody who's capable of keeping all of that out of it. And so for me, as a former reporter, one of the things I would tell people, particularly when you're voting for candidates and when you're thinking about who you're going to vote for, listen to the candidates in their own words as much as you can. What are they saying? And then hold it up to the great commandment. Hold it up to by their fruit you'll know them. And again, I'm not at all saying that most people are flawed. Most people are going to have downsides to them, right? But when it comes to Galatians 5 and the fruits of the Spirit versus the not fruits of the Spirit, are you really thinking deeply about these candidates and how they hold up with their own words and what they are saying themselves about what they think and what they believe? I'm not talking about the 5-second clip that's pulled out, but I mean, are you listening to the whole speech? Are you listening to? And it is a lot of work to do that.
Yeah,
it is. But that's part of, if you want to be an informed voter, that's one of the things you have to do. And I voted on Sunday because early voting is available to us here in Florida. I voted. Rochelle and I sat down. We went through they send a sample ballot out. We went through and we did as much research on the candidates as we could. And let's just be honest, there's enough initiatives and things on there. I don't know every judge that's there. I don't have time to review all their cases and all that. So I do the best I can. I researched what I could and kind of came to conclusions based on the information that I was able to find, the amount of time I was able to put into it. But again, I spent time, I prayed about it. Lord, help me to vote for the right person. And if I'm voting for the wrong person, whatever, in the end, you're in charge.
Yeah.
You're in charge, and I think it's important to note that these decisions do matter. They often carry massive implications, if not for me, for others.
For others, yeah.
And I think we need to be aware of that. And when we see people getting really upset and angry, a lot of times that's an indication that there's a lot of fear and sometimes very justified fear for what a certain political party or politician could mean for a certain group of people.
Sure.
And we see it on both sides. I mean, fear is maybe the number one motivator politicians use to get people to vote.
To vote, absolutely.
The fear of things being taken away, and sometimes those fears are very justified. They're very real. They will happen, and other times they're just being exploited by people who are trying to make you afraid to get you to vote in a certain way.
Yeah.
And again, it takes some time studying, some time paying attention, reading multiple news sources, not just the news source that appeals to you the most. I really try to read a multitude of different. I try to read everything from Fox News to MSNBC to CNN to Sky News to foreign news outlets. And again, that takes a lot of time. But if you really do believe that this matters, that there's things on the line, then it's worth doing your homework and paying attention to things.
It was perfect because Ken took my last piece. I just appreciate it. I have seen on this election cycle, man, more churches than I can count that are up front telling people how to vote. You should not vote for this party or this candidate. You should not vote for this. And I've always been a big believer that the separation of church and state, for all that it is also really good for us to say exactly what Ken said. Be involved, do your research, pray about it, and then do the best that you can. And instead of Ken saying you should vote for this person, or this person, or vote no on what I saw last night on a walk. Vote no on 4. I don't know what 4 is yet because I haven't done.
And it's hard for me not to. I have strong opinions on these
course.
things. Like I said, I used to cover politics, so I have strong opinions. And anybody who really knows me well and spends any time with me will sometimes hear those spill out in private with the small group of friends that I have that I can share some of those things with. But I recognize that here at Whole Life, we have people that vote in all kinds of different ways here.
Yeah.
And I think that, again, what I would rather do is encourage people to vote on principles than vote on people. Because when you start encouraging voting for people and parties, there are some I know that as a reporter, I just met some really, really wonderful people in both the parties that I was covering and outside of those parties as well. And I met some really awful people in both parties that I could never have voted for, no matter what they said their policy was. I know who they were as a human being, and there was zero doubt in my mind that they would back out of the policies they said they were going to be standing up for if it became more politically convenient for them to do so. Yeah. So, like I said, I just encourage people really, really be thoughtful about this. And
Ken gave you the best tip possible. This is something I started doing, I think 3 or 4 election cycles ago. When my sample ballot comes in, if you're registered in your county to vote, you're going to get, whether you're an independent like me or you're a Republican or a Democrat for your party, whichever you're associated, you're going to get a sample ballot with everything that comes on it. And I take my Sharpie at home, and over the course of a couple of weeks, I'll start filling it out, looking at the races. I have a very specific process that I use for incumbents. I don't know. Anyway, I'm not going to get into that, but seriously, fill it out and take it with you. You can take it into the box. And someone's like, you can't do that. It's absolutely you can. That is a misnomer. And just take it filled out, and that way you've prayed about it. The answers that you have are the ones
I actually took pictures of our sample ballot
and put
it on my phone and went through, and because I want to make sure that
I did
it's hard to remember every judge's name.
Was this the one I said yes or no on? Yeah,
it's hard to remember all of it. So yeah.
And if you are not registered, this is something that I found out. I think it was two ago, because a friend was like, I'm not registered, so I didn't get a sample ballot ahead of time. And I'm like, well, ballotpedia.org. This is a really cool place. If you go to ballotpedia, ballotpedia.org, if you type in your address, it'll tell you what is on the ballot in your area. And so I looked it up again last night just to kind of go through the process, and finds me in Florida, and it puts all the initiatives on there. And the cool part is it will actually, just like Ken took it on his phone, you can put all your answers in. It will give you a multitude of source material even to research. So if you don't have a ton of time, even at that, it'll give you, there were articles from Orlando Sentinel, from the Tampa Bay Sun-Times, from all these different places, and they try to take the language of some of these amendments and things that
those are confusing.
They get really confusing. What does it actually mean? And I felt like they did a pretty good job of explaining it. And then you can mark your ballot on that, and they'll either email it to you so you have it, or you can go in on your account and check it out. So it's just a really handy way if you're going to do the prep work and you're going to do the research, that you don't get it wrong later. So that was the it's hard to remember what you went through when there's that many a lot of times on that ballot. Okay, let's get to our first text message. It was from Mariana, who said, "Hello to my favorite podcast." Aww. I've been enjoying the series on Dominion, and I think it's quite helpful during this election season. Daniel and his friends did not waver on their faith and values at any point, and I'm having a hard time processing how to do the same and consider the candidates for presidency. I'm voting based on the policies that the candidate is proposing, not their personality. Based on that, it's pretty clear to me who has Christian values, who doesn't. Isn't that the correlation between Daniel and this election, or am I completely off? Should we be bending our beliefs or what the Bible tells is right or wrong based on the candidate's likability? Sincerely, Mariana. That's tough.
So, here's what I would say. When people tell you who they are, believe them.
Sure.
And when I hire people, I don't hire people based off of their interview. People can kind of probably lose a job in an interview for me, but really the interview doesn't really matter too much to me, because I've met people who are horrible at interviewing and are fantastic employees. And I've met people who are amazing at interviewing and are lousy employees. And for me, what I've discovered is kind of the best metric for kind of is what have you done, and what do I know about you? What do people say about you? And so I kind of apply that same thing to elections. Election is a lot like an interview. People will tell you all kinds of things, but who are they? Anybody can say they're a Christian. Are they living like a Christian? Are they being loving? Are they living out the Christian principles that they are wanting other people to live out? And I guess I get a little bit worried about this, because I haven't met a whole lot of politicians that do a great job of living on both sides.
Sure.
And so, but again, one of the questions that I ask myself is, what do I know about this person? What do and what are the most important values to me?
Yeah.
And for me, what's super important to me is candidates who will allow the country. As a Seventh-day Adventist, this is just, I guess maybe growing up, this was such a big thing for me as a Seventh-day Adventist, because we've been taught, right, that there'll come a time where our right to worship on the seventh-day Sabbath would be taken away. And so I think that this is, again, just admitting biases. This is one of mine, but I've always wanted to vote for people who would not take away that right from me. And by implication, I also then think, well, then I want to make sure that I'm not going to vote for people that are going to take away the rights of people that I don't agree with.
Oh, yeah.
That have different, because if they're going to take away their rights, they'll take away my rights too. And so if I want my freedom, then I need to make sure that I'm giving that same thing to other people as well, and voting for candidates that will do the same. And so
that's a tough one, because if there's issues of freedom for someone else that you may also not necessarily agree with, to me, it's hard to err anywhere but the side of freedom, where everyone gets to, short of, like you mentioned, the being destructive or being hateful maybe to other people or to affecting their lives in a negative way. It's hard. It's hard to do that.
Yeah.
to make and to make like where's that cutoff line in like how far can I support this even though I don't agree with it, but I do believe that freedom has to come first, or the next time it's one of mine.
Yeah. This goes back to the impossibility of being able to interpret a dream that you don't even know what the dream is. And again, and so again, to me, this comes down to that really prayerfully asking God to lead you on that vote, and not just leaning on your own. You might be really smart, but not just leaning on that, but really asking God, help me know what to do here. Help me to give me what I need to make this right decision and to do what's right. And I don't think it's easy. Again, I think a lot of us in this election have some pretty strong feelings on both sides of this. Mariana mentioned the presidential side of things, but there's a lot of other important races in there as well. But particularly on the presidential side, there's very strong feelings, and it's interesting that I will. You regularly hear from people on both sides of this political. You'll hear from the people who are very pro Donald Trump. You'll hear from the people who are very pro Kamala Harris. That as a pastor, you need to do more to support one side or the other, or say less or say whatever. So it's always interesting around this election time as a pastor trying to, care about what's right and understanding that these elections do have massive implications for people. They really do.
Yeah.
And also understand that your first allegiance comes to God. But what does that look like in the context of what's here on earth? So it's an interesting place to be.
Well, people were paying attention in the chat for sure. Mama Doc said, every day I ask for God's wisdom to do and say and act in his will because I have failed in the past. And you're in good company, Mama Doc.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So I feel you there. And then Sonia said, God gave these kings the dreams and used these men to interpret it. God made the connection. He works in mysterious ways, and maybe their lives were tests from God to prove their growth and loyalty, which prepared them for a bigger purpose in life. And you kind of think about when I read that, it made me think of, Daniel spent a life of this, of being involved. It's who he was. It was his, like you mentioned, it was his education level. It was his place to be there. And maybe this is the growth part of it, where how can we get through an election where, you may have to pull the lever in a couple different places where you're like, ugh, that's going to sting a little. But also, I'm going to hang my hat here because this is what keeps coming back to me. This is the part of, someone else's freedom, whatever that might be. And so, Sonia, I feel like that's the same. God uses us, even though he doesn't have to. He could, he's in control. But clearly, the part about the Daniel story is he wants to and he will. And it's a pretty cool story that the God of the universe, bails out not only Daniel and his friends. He brings the clarity to a king, and he does it all in grand fashion. It's just it's really cool to think that wherever we are and whatever our station is, he's doing the same in our lives. Is it is a book going to be written about what those are later? Well, I guess the rest is yet to be written. But she also said, love this chat. Nothing better than to chat with meaning and purpose. God bless you all. So, Sonia, it was great to have you in the chat this week. And this is the first time maybe you've registered in a different, don't remember Sonia. So if you're new, just want to say welcome, and please do continue to come back every week. We do enjoy meeting everyone on our online family as well. And we had an email from Randy that said, considering the sermon this week, October 26th, if you could preach a sermon to a church of Germans in the weeks leading up to the 1932 elections in Germany, is this what you'd preach, given the genocide over the next decade? If you were a European Jew who had any thoughts on what might happen with the rise of the Nazi Party and Hitler, is this a sermon that would bring any comfort?
For me, to answer that question, yeah. So the question was, is this a sermon that I would have preached if I were in Germany in 1933, leading up to that election?
With the same principles that you're talking about, maybe in this message, would they be applicable to that, knowing what to come, even though probably nobody totally did?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it is. And here's why I think it is what I would preach about, because, and to the comfort side of things, I hope it brings, and it may not. And look, clearly, it seems like Randy doesn't feel like it would have, and that's fine. And maybe Randy's right, I don't know. But my hope out of this series was firstly to encourage us to think deeply about how we're voting, what we're doing. But I think more importantly to me, I don't believe that the sermon that I'm giving here at Whole Life, I believe if I got up and took a position on this is who you should vote for or do this, I don't believe that would make any influence on which way the election went. In fact, I think it would probably divide our church, and there would be, if I said vote this person, then all the people that were not for that person are going to immediately tune me out because I'm biased and I just hate the person that they like. And same for the other candidate. So for me, I want to encourage people to think about principles as they're voting. I want them to think about, again, the great commandment. Are you voting for command? Are you thinking about the fruits? Are you thinking about loving your neighbor? Are these things that you're thinking about? These are principles, and you can, people can infer all day long what I think about which candidate is that, and you may be right, you may be wrong, but those are principles that I feel very comfortable talking to people about because, again, candidates are candidates. And when I think about what I want people to understand is that when you look at Daniel, one of the things that you know is that nations do horrendous things. And bad things happen. I mean, it's very nice that, as we're going to find out this next week, that that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego don't get burnt up when they get thrown into the fiery furnace. Would that were true for the millions that were killed in the Holocaust?
Yeah, correct.
That they survived the flames. Holocaust is horrendous, and so it's nice that we see Daniel surviving. It's nice that we see that. But I do think that the person, when Daniel was written, it was written not just wasn't written that for these people that are in the story. It was written for people after them that were going through really difficult situations with oppression from the Roman government, from Greece, and they're experiencing these horrible things. And the message of Daniel is not that God's going to spare your life out of that. God's message is that I'm there with you.
Yeah.
I'm there with you when these bad things happen. This is not the final kingdom. The final kingdom is that stone without hands, and that's the kingdom that we look forward to. And yes, here on earth we try to do our best to create a place that's safe for others, that's a good place here, that's not an oppressive power here on earth. And we understand that when those oppressive powers happen, because we live in just a messed up world, when those happen, God is still with us. And so I know that my hope, whether I was able to execute on this or not, I don't know. My hope is to bring hope to people as they listen to this, that God's in charge. And when things don't go the way we think they should, God's still in charge. God is still with us, and we can trust God in spite of that, in spite of what's going on in the world around us. We can trust God, and that the human politics is never going to be the answer to the problems of the world. And I know that that's not particularly satisfying, but it's so far in world history, it's a proven fact, and we're trying to we try to move towards something different.
Better,
and I will always fight to move to that better thing. And that said, when it doesn't happen, I'm not going to be surprised either.
Right.
I'm not going to think, oh wow, that means God's not there. God doesn't care. I do believe God cares. I believe God is there, as we're going to talk about this week, that God is with me in the fire.
Yeah.
And so, Randy, if this was dissatisfying for you, man, I'm sorry about that, because I do want it to have comfort. I know, Randy, that this election has massive implications from where you're sitting and from what you're seeing, and I get that, and I definitely want to. I want to stand up for right. I want to speak against what's wrong, and I want to be the most effective that I can be in those. And I also want to bring comfort.
Yeah.
And so, it is my hope. I think this is the sermon series I would have preached at that point if that's where I was at. I do think so, and right or wrong, I do think so.
Well, everyone has been enjoying the Daniel series, and I think
no, maybe not everybody.
For the but I think for enjoying the fact that even if it's not something that maybe brought as much comfort to, because there probably are people that it's not going to be as comforting for some as others, and of course we would love it just like we would love politics to solve the problems that they claim they're going to solve, and we know that that's not going to happen. But the overall feel of Daniel at this time, even though it may make us uncomfortable and it may make us, not find maybe some comfort, it's so hard to find any, no matter which side you're on. I mean, you talk to people on both sides. No one is satisfied with their candidate in total. There's things that they know, or that like, I wish if this would be better than it would be. We'd be winning by more, or So I think that part is almost completely elusive in the world of politics, but in Daniel, satisfaction in that we're not doing a sermon about something that isn't consequential for where we're at and for what we're doing and where we are. Whether the conclusions that we come to differently bring us a different level of comfort, I know that's not really rewarding either, but I feel like we're trying to hit it head on and say this is what we get it, we know, we're feeling it too as a staff, and I'm sure, and as you personally. And then how do I go about trying to uplift, try to bring comfort, try to bring a little sense maybe of a few things.
And another part is, how do we keep community? That's another important part of this whole thing to me, is that it's so easy during this experience for us to watch people write other people off.
Yeah.
And be like, well, if you don't see it the way I do, then we have nothing to talk about. We're not going to be together. And again, when there's huge issues that have massive implications for your life, I understand why people would feel that way. At the same time, again, my obligation and this church's obligation is to the rock, that rock without hands. That's the kingdom that we are a part of, that our ultimate allegiance is to. And that means that when I see people of every kindred, nation, and tongue at the foot of the throne in Revelation, it means that those people almost surely have different ideas about things. And so my goal, whether I execute it well or not, I don't know, but my goal is through this election to keep us together, to keep us loving each other, to be giving those values of love, acceptance, forgiveness, grace. It's easy to be accepting of people that have the same values as me and the same ideas as me. It's easy to forgive people who do small things. But these are the big values here at Whole Life: love, acceptance, forgiveness, grace, worship, participation in the Bible. These are things that we really value. And so my goal, like I said, through this period of time, is to keep us together as a church, not to as a community, as a family. And yes, to encourage to do the right thing, to think deeply before we vote. And when it's over, that we are still the Whole Life Church, a church where we love people into a lifelong friendship with God.
That's it. Well, Melanie, we would have loved to love you into a hour-long conversation on the podcast this morning. We missed you. And next week, though, we'll let you. I'm looking at her chair like she's there, and it's like I'm talking to her, and it's not the same. So we've had the plan, the dream,
The fire.
the fire. Ooh, all right. I'm looking forward to Lucas's graphics. There were comments this week from people who were
He's awesome.
We're
Guys,
loving
it's so
we're
good.
loving the little
So good.
chats that were happening
Yeah.
on the screen.
I love it.
And so we're going to talk about the fire this week, and then we have 3 more. Then right after that, but and that wraps out a total of 6. So you definitely don't want to miss that. And we've had double the host, double the fun on the chat lately. And as we get ready for worship every week, the online hosts are there interacting with y'all. So if you haven't been on the stream for a while, it's worth your time to tune in. And like Sonia said, it's a great way to spend time with people that care about each other, love each other, pray with each other, and just have great conversations. Then we bring it all back here to you on the podcast, so you can catch up on all that as well. So looking forward to that. Looking forward to Melanie being back, and that's going to do it. Thanks for listening, guys. Have a great week.